This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, we're continuing our D&D 2024 Practical Possibilities coverage with the freshly redesigned Cleric. If you want to hear weekly discussions of TTRPG design and philosophy, check out the Untitled TTRPG podcast I do with Rel over on his YouTube channel and on Spotify. And if you want to contact me directly, you can message me in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord or email me at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com. All linked in the description below. Cleric is our first full spellcaster we'll be covering in this series, and also happens to be another great example of the String of Pearls design I mentioned with Fighter and Rogue. After all, a spellcaster's power comes from the spells they can cast, and there have been quite a few notable adjustments to some of the Cleric's most iconic spells. First, Cure Wounds and Healing Word have doubled in impact, now healing a target for 2d8 and 2d4 respectively. Each spell slot increase is also by 2d8 and 2d4, making healing a lot stronger than it was in 2014. Now, before any meat grinder GMs grab pitchforks though, the 2025 Monster Manual is supposed to have monsters that deal significantly more damage. So while it feels more powerful in 5e's current environment, the actual balance may be different once we get the new monsters. The other big controversial change is that Spiritual Weapon now requires concentration. Spiritual Weapon, from my experience, has always been a popular pick for clerics at my table, and one of its unique characteristics was that it didn't require concentration, meaning that after a turn of setup, a cleric could concentrate on a spell like Spirit Guardians, while also taking a bonus action to hit with Spiritual Weapon. Its actual efficacy is debated in optimization circles, but the new concentration tag is certainly going to mean it'll see less play than it has in the past. Overall, on the spells front, I think Cleric will see similar selections as it did in 2014, with healing being a bit more common since it might be worth using outside of an ally dropping to 0. So let's talk about the Cleric base class, and we'll start with the elephant in the room. Clerics now receive their subclass at level 3 instead of level 1, which a lot of D&D fans are unhappy with. I can see why. The lore that the community has grown accustomed to is that clerics draw their magic from a deity, and one of the character choices in clerics in 2014 would have been to pick the deity the character worshipped, along with the domain that reflected it. In 2014, there were a lot of different domains that tried to broadly encompass all of the different profiles that different D&D gods could represent. Many of those in 2014 didn't make it into this new PHB, including Knowledge, Nature, and Tempest. Now, in the new PHB, the lore is instead that a domain is, quote-unquote, favored by a god, pantheon, or religious order, which to me expands what a domain could represent in different fantasy worlds. Now, mechanically, I like the change of subclass level. Jeremy Crawford's main reasoning is that it allows new players to learn the cleric's mechanics in a more digestible way before having to pick a specialization, and I think this method accomplishes that. I also understand why it would be jarring for players that are accustomed to D&D lore. Personally, I've always told my players that in my worlds, a cleric's magic is an expression of their commitment to a philosophy, which may or may not be religious in nature. Cleric magic comes from within, although some individuals may find that they can only unlock their inner strength through worship. Therefore, a god's domain may differ from the domain of the individual clerics that worship them. It's definitely a different interpretation of cleric mechanics, but one that I think is a little easier to reconcile, especially with this new framework. If you're still not buying it, remember that DMs are welcome to, and even encouraged, to start their games at level 3, which also resolves this dissonance. And if it really bothers you, you could always talk to your DM about using legacy rules. I don't think it would really break too much. That being said, one of the major subclass features that clerics have always gained at first level is now just a standard base class feature, Divine Order, which allows you to pick if your character is proficient with martial weapons and heavy armor, or if they'll gain an extra cantrip and get to add their wisdom bonus to arcana and religion checks. This used to be tied to subclass, but now it's an extra dial that players get to play with. Similarly, at level 7, Blessed Strikes used to be either an increase to weapon attack damage or an increase to the damage of cantrips. That also was tied to subclass. But now, each cleric gets to choose for themselves if they're going to lean more into being a weapon user or more of a cantrip caster. I used to house rule anyway that these two choices were modular as like how they're presented now. So overall for me, it's just nice to see it officially implemented in the game. Going back to level 2, this is when clerics get Channel Divinity. And this time there's a new option, Divine Spark, which offers another way for clerics to either heal or damage when they use it. The classic Channel Divinity, Turn Undead, now has cleaner mechanics that inflict the frightened and incapacitated conditions on undead. And interestingly enough, incapacitated doesn't restrict a creature's movement, only their actions. I'm guessing the effect is likely going to be similar than the old Turn Undead, but I think that by tying it to frightened and incapacitated, it'll be a little bit easier for GMs to rule. This feature also gets upgraded at 5th level to Seer Undead. Destroy Undead, which is what this used to be, was this kind of complicated way of potentially auto-killing undead of a certain CR threshold, and a lot of the times it just wouldn't work. Whereas Seer Undead is just damage, so the undead that would normally be automatically destroyed will probably be destroyed anyway, but it also gives some sort of use to higher powered undead that would normally be immune to the Destroy Undead effect. Now, probably one of the most controversial changes in all of D&D 2024 is the change to Divine Intervention. Now, originally, this feature suffered from what Jeremy Crawford called a Mother May I mechanic, meaning that its power was really tied to what the GM would allow. But now, it's a cleaner design. You get to pick any cleric spell of 5th level or lower that isn't a reaction, and cast it as an action without a spell slot or material components. Now, Jeremy Crawford talked about the intention behind this design. It's supposed to be used with spells like Raise Dead, which normally have a costly component, and allows you to shortcut that in order to have kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card in case something goes really, really wrong. However, optimizers have talked about how there's an obvious abuse by combining Divine Intervention with the Hallow spell, which normally takes 24 hours to cast. It's a highly versatile spell that could allow a player to unexpectedly dominate an encounter, depending on the creature types that the DM is using. I'm just gonna say, if you're a player and thinking about this rules as written cheesy mechanic, just speak to your GM first, so as not to start some sort of argument or completely undercut all the work that they've tried to do in creating some sort of epic moment. Or, at the very least, be okay with your GM rejecting it at the table, even though it's a written rule. It is extremely powerful and can be very disruptive for the game overall. I can definitely see some hurt feelings coming about by just having a clever player spring this on a GM. Now, overall, in terms of class complexity, the player's handbook labels clerics as average. And I think I can agree with that for the most part. From a build perspective, I don't think clerics are going to have as many options as, say, a fighter. Whereas a fighter has to figure out their ideal weapon masteries, gear, ability score distributions, feat selection. Clerics are going to be a little bit more predictable. Divine Order is really going to be the big fighting style choice, where you're going to choose between having better gear or leaning into more of a caster role. Anyone that's played a spellcaster will tell you that the real complexity comes down to managing spells. If you're a new player and you feel overwhelmed by spell selection, there are some spell optimization guides where even if you're not looking to build a min-maxed character, they are nice in just clearly explaining what each spell does. And that being said, I think of all the spellcasting classes, the cleric spells tend to be pretty straightforward. Like Cure Wounds, cures wounds. Shield of Faith offers an AC boost. Guiding Bolt can deal a lot of damage if it hits. Where an optimization guide will come in handy is letting you know, hey, at lower levels, Guiding Bolt is taking up a significant resource, and there's a high risk, high reward dynamic going on with it. A lot of times I find Guiding Bolt is much better at, say, 3rd or 4th level, where you have a whole lot of 1st level spell slots you can burn through, but you can keep some higher level slots in reserve. That being said, I find the instinct of thinking of spellcasters just having to keep track of spells and understand how they work as complex. But if we look at all of the different spellcasting classes, I think Cleric is on the lower end of complexity of all the spellcasting classes, but still probably a little ahead in terms of complexity of most martial-focused characters. If you're interested in learning how to play a spellcaster, having a few different options that you can rotate between, or just learning how to play support, I really think Cleric is one of the best starting places. It has the ability to heal, but as we'll discuss throughout this coverage, I don't think you can look at one class as the quote-unquote healer, especially since Magic Initiate is an origin feat that pretty much any class can take. And this brings us to the Cleric's role. Now, I think Clerics are support characters, in the most abstract definition of the term. Now, many players consider quote-unquote support as just healing and buffs. To me, though, support means helping the team in the way that makes the most sense in the moment. A lot of times, this does mean healing and buffs. If an ally is at 0 hit points, it makes sense to heal them. Sometimes, rather than casting a cantrip or making a weapon attack, it also makes sense to cast a spell like Shield of Faith or Protection from Evil and Good to decrease the probability that you or an ally will take damage. However, sometimes the best thing to do in combat is to just focus on damage, especially if no one needs healing and you're already concentrating on some sort of buff effect. Especially since the Cleric's 2 big damage types, Radiant and Necrotic, were at least 2 of the most reliable in 2014, and I have a feeling are going to continue to be reliable in 2024. Again, we have to see the monster manual to confirm any of this. Clerics also have a few decent control spells that, when well timed, can really turn the tables on an encounter. I distinctly remember one game where we were all level 7 and the DM had set up a party of 8 rival adventurers for the session's final battle, each of which had complex spellcasting mechanics. Now, at the time, I was playing a bard, and I had opened with plant growth to lock out their movement. Another player was playing a cleric, who casted silence, and because the rival party really depended on spellcasting to get out of jams, it really shut down the combat, and it was amazing how quickly we were able to just dominate this rival adventuring party built to the same level from a really simple control combo. To me, the point of support isn't having one thing you do all the time, but rather having the ability to analyze a situation and pick the best tool for the job, which often means being fluid in your thinking. It's why I think support is the most difficult of the 4 traditional roles to do well. It takes a strong knowledge of what everyone else is doing, while at the same time understanding how you can meaningfully contribute. That being said, of the other support classes, the 2 big ones I'm thinking of being Bard and Druid, I think Cleric has a little bit more forgiveness in its options. There aren't too many bad choices to make. And even though there may be a best or a few best options in a given situation, there are still a lot of good options that I find allow Cleric players to feel successful. Now, like with Fighter and Rogue, we're going to break down the 4 Cleric subclasses in this book, in order of complexity, but not necessarily power or fun. Although in this case, I do think that it does go from least fun to more fun, but that's my personal opinion. As a reminder, one of the goals of these Practical Possibilities episodes is to make it clear, especially for new players, what kind of character you're getting into. Now, one thing to know about Cleric right away is that automatically, Cleric subclasses are way more complex than Fighter or Rogue subclasses. At level 3, all 4 of the Cleric subclasses instantly expand a Cleric spell list with always prepared options, a third option for their Channel Divinity, and a bonus feature that's just thematic to the subclass. Because of the backwards compatibility, the level 3 subclass is almost like squishing in like 3 levels of subclass features all at once. There's potentially a lot to keep track of. But the nice thing I find is that even if a new player doesn't make the most of some of these features, the Cleric on its own will still perform pretty well. In my opinion, the simplest of these subclass features is the Life Domain. Life Domain spells are all very Cleric feeling. They're pretty much healing and buff centric, meaning that a Cleric is free to play with other iconic spells from their base list, while being sure that their go-to options like Cure Wounds, Bless, and Lesser Restoration are always available. The Channel Divinity Preserve Life is a simple multi-target heal. I don't think it's the most effective heal of its class, but it's there with an extra resource if leaning into healing really is the thing you want to do. Now, the series of features, Disciple of Life, Blessed Healer, and Supreme Healing, really just in one way or another boost the amount of hit points regained by casting healing spells. Unlike video game RPGs, a lot of the math determining healing in D&D shows that even these boosts don't significantly affect healing, and healing by itself usually isn't a great role to build your whole character around, which is one of the reasons why my definition of support is so broad. However, for a new player, I think these simple boosts will feel good and aren't too much to keep track of. Next is one of my go-to domains from 2014, the Light Domain, which essentially allows your Cleric to double as a blaster. Unlike Life Domain, Light Domain adds a lot of spells Clerics wouldn't normally have access to, like Fairy Fire, Burning Hands, and yes, Fireball. Radiance of the Dawn is a neat Channel Divinity that deals a little bit of AoE radiant damage with an effect that removes magical darkness, which, for as situational as that sounds, I've actually seen a lot of players, including myself, successfully use a few times at the table. 2 memorable results. Then, of course, there's Warding Flare, a defensive reaction that imposes disadvantage on an attack roll made against you or an ally within 30 feet of you. This feature actually got boosted from the 2014 version, in that in 2014, originally you could only use Warding Flare to protect yourself, and it would upgrade at level 6 to being able to protect an ally. But right from first level in 2024, Warding Flare can protect anybody. Clerics don't get a lot of reactions, and although you can pick up something like Shield with Magic Initiate, it's just a nice way to kind of round out their action economy. I find that many Cleric players find that additional blast spells from Light Domain are empowering. They can both deal damage and heal, and they feel more adaptable than getting stuck doing one thing over and over again. Now, in terms of complexity, I think next I would rank War Domain. Although I appreciate that Clerics can have heavy armor training, I've rarely seen, at the tables I've run, weapon-using Clerics contribute as much as the spell-focused ones, even with Divine Strike or magic items. It's not that I don't think it can be done, but rather in the past I've seen War Domain best used as a part of a multi-class, usually combining the Guided Strike Channel Divinity with the old -5 to attack +10 to damage rules of the 2014 versions of Great Weapon Master and Sharpshooter. The War Priest bonus action also just seems a little clunky to me, but maybe it's because I haven't spent a lot of time with it. It just always seemed that there were other martial hybrid clerics, like Tempest Domain or Order Domain, that seem to just work better than war. Again, that isn't to say I think war can't be used well. I just think it takes a somewhat experienced player to make the most of the mechanics that are offered. As a war cleric, you have to know how to build both a full caster and competent weapon user. You have to stat your character appropriately ahead of time, and you have to be mindful of your timing and positioning. Now, of course, the most complex is also the subclass I think I'm most excited about, which is the trickery domain. The spells, while thematic, definitely require some nuance to use. So while life is getting cure wounds and bless, and light is getting burning hands, trickery domain is getting charm person and disguise self, which can be really fun, but they aren't really reliable combat options. Now, the standout feature is Invoke Duplicity, a channel divinity which creates an illusory duplicate which can grant advantage on attack rolls when positioned correctly, and can serve as an alternative point of origin for spells that you cast. For experienced spellcasting players, there's a lot of cool things you can do with Trickery Domain, but for new players, there's a lot to understand to use it most effectively. Probably the coolest thing it gets is at level 6, there's a thing where you can teleport and switch places with your illusory duplicate. This is actually a mechanic I used in a boss fight not that long ago, and it really frustrated my players, so I can't imagine what it would be like using it against a dungeon master. As for multiclassing, I think the most attractive feature that clerics have that other builds may want is its level 1 heavy armor training. Whereas other classes only grant up to medium armor proficiency when multiclassing into them. Because heavy armor training is part of the cleric's divine order feature, if a character doesn't start with heavy armor training, multiclassing one level into cleric is one of the most reliable ways to get it. Plus, you get some helpful cleric spells like Bless or Healing Word. In my day, I've seen quite a few sorcerer or wizard builds stat themselves to multiclass one level into cleric for some serious versatility and survivability boosts. Just remember that if you want to do something like that, you'll need to have a decent strength score to make the most of it. In addition, Ian from Incendium RPGs pointed out to me that Trickery Cleric has some nice synergy with a rogue, since Invoke Duplicity can guarantee that you can get advantage with each of your attacks, which serves as one of the ways to solve the sneak attack problem I posed in the last episode. Lastly, like I mentioned before, Guided Strike and War Priest from War Domain are great ways for a martial-focused character to get some boosts to their effectiveness. The cleric spells that come along with it also add some versatility, but this is a case where the subclass features are really what give the big benefit. Unlike Fighter and Rogue though, I'm not seeing a lot of synergy that stands out where the cleric base class benefits from dipping into other classes. For full casters, the biggest benefit is that you get an accelerated casting progression. And so while I can see a lot of reasons to take a few levels of cleric to boost another character, I don't see a lot of reasons to leave your cleric's progression to pick up other features. Maybe more combos will reveal themselves as the community spends more time with this content. Overall, I think Cleric is a great way to start learning how to play support with some decent depth for experienced players. When built well, it'll often feel like there are a lot of good options to select, and the game within the game becomes figuring out the best options in a dynamic environment. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragon Mind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Theslian Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at theslianstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development in the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.